So for the agenda of today, the main expectation will be for us to give a slight overview about what it is X-eHealth project. Then Catherine Kronaki from HL7 International will give an introduction about HL7 CDA context, a very brief one, and then we'll pass to the hands-on of this specific session that will be handled by Mrs. Leora Artschuler and Mr. Rick Gimmer from the Antenna Constitution Group, and will be a session about how using CDA to build the world on FHIR. In the end, we are going to have, let's say, some topics for question and answer, and of course, if you have any doubt at this stage, please, you may use the chat. So about, let's say, our company, about the shared services of Ministry of Health for the people that are new to us. So we are a public health enterprise that were created in 2010. So mainly we are the National e-health competence center for e-health in Portugal. Our main areas of focus, it is in terms of processing and logistics, the financial services for the IT, human resource, and of course our core core deliver services. It is about information, communication, and systems and technology. So the IT goods and services for the NHS. Next slide. In terms of the project itself, we are here as a coordinator of X-eHealth, European co-funded project. And what it is our main contribution, it is how can we ensure the implementation of the electronic health record exchange format recommendations and really contribute on the implementation of the strategy of the European Commission of the digital single market. With this aim, there are three pillars that are very important to us, and they are the following in terms of the citizen security of access to health data. So it is how can we provide this specific feature to our fellow European citizens and to the national one? How can we build strong infrastructures and interoperable infrastructure towards a personalized medicine? And in the end, our core focus, it will be the citizen empowerment and how can we deliver the right digital tools to the different population. In terms of the information of the specific objectives, they are in the screen. So I'm just to keep here the most important thing. It is that we are laying down the foundation to advance the integration of process in the healthcare service features. So in a way, it is how can we improve the quality and the safety of the health data, and how can we contribute to the standardization and harmonization of the health services at the European Union. So this is the core objective of the X-eHealth project, and it is one of the part of today's session. In terms of the areas that we touch upon, the main purpose of the project is to develop a common framework for these information domains in terms of the medical images and reports, discharge letters, laboratory results, and rare diseases. So this is the main objective of the project, is to specify and to how can we share this data on a coded and on the structured format. And what it is our ambition as a project is to deliver concrete specifications and implementation guides in CDA that could be compliant with the existing European projects. In terms of our main results that we would like, let's say, to deliver in the end, it is really to build a strong collaborative community that's not only about the private industry or the public industry. It is really about the academia, the vendors, and of course the different experts that work in these standardization domains, and how can we promote the use of common models in order to contribute to the defragmentation of the digital health services and tools, and really to don't work in silos, but to try to connect the different health information across the pathway of the healthcare services. So with that in mind, Catherine, of course, this is already part of our kind of do in this specific introduction of the expected results. There is a strong role that we would like, let's say, to give in terms of the digital inclusion, but as the HL7 Europe, what do you think it is, of course, the role of CDA in the project and, of course, in the landscaping?
I think the right person to speak about it is probably the people that are involved in the cross-border services, because they are making such a huge effort to align and to make reality the incremental interoperability we are striving for. I think it is important. It is a very important role, but it's also important to constantly innovate and move forward. And I think this is what I expect to hear in the presentation of Rick and Leora next.
Great.
So maybe I can introduce Leora briefly.
Well, let me pick it up if you'd like, Catherine.
Okay, go ahead.
You can talk while I put up this slide about our polling application. We want to hear from all of you at a few different points during the presentation, and then of course we'll have Q&A after our prepared remarks. But if you can go to your web browser to this pollev.com/cooltrain 562, then you'll register and you'll be all ready to respond to our polls. And Catherine, if you want to speak for a minute, I'll just put up, this is a test poll, and you should be able to, once you're logged into pollev.com, cooltrain 562, which you see at the top of the screen, tell us something about where you are dialing in from. And Catherine, if you have some introductory remarks, now would be the time, as we'll see if we get some responses here.
So Leora is quite old.
Thanks, Catherine. That's obvious. I have my camera on.
All right. But she's also very young. She's also very young because the ideas that she conveyed over the years have an amazing duration in time. So she, for those of you that don't know that, Leora linked her name with HTML, which is the predecessor of XML. And she actually authored a book in 1995, which was called ABCD, which was called ABCD of HTML, 1995. So we are talking today about structured data. We are talking about terminologies, but she was there first. So that's a first for Leora. Another first for Leora that you may not know is that she was one of the predecessors of the collaboration between HIMSS, HL7 and IHC. She had the insight, and she actually implemented the first joint implementation guides between the three organizations under the Health Story initiative, of which she led the strategy and development. So that's a second first. The third first is, I think, something that she shares with Rick Gamer, who is the Chief Innovation Officer of Lantana, and that's CDA on FHIR. So without further ado, I would like to leave the floor to Leora and Rick. Thank you very much for joining us here today. It's a rare pleasure and privilege to have you.
Thank you, Catherine. That is an introduction I will treasure for the rest of my long life, my already long life. So thank you all. This is so exciting to see where you are all from. And I have to thank the X-eHealth initiative for giving Rick and I the opportunity to speak to you today about using CDA to build a world on fire. It's wonderful to learn something about the X-eHealth community and framework and your objectives, and just to feel closer to our friends and colleagues in Europe. It's been too long, and hopefully we will be together, physically together, before too very long. So first, just a little bit about Lantana. That obviously that was our last in-person company-wide retreat, which was 2019. So we're about 16 years old. I'm in the process of selling the company to the employees, which is something that they support very strongly here in the US. It's a wonderful process. We have a diverse staff and offices across the US, Canada, Australia, not yet in Europe. Our mission is improving healthcare through health information. And we support that by developing standards both through our volunteer practice and through our consulting practice. And our approach to our mission is to use open data standards to support the exchange of information that really brings alive this information we're bringing onto the computer today. So we're living in an electronic healthcare ecosystem, and we need to get the full benefit out of that. So here's a little bit about us, not much about me, and an arm's length list of Rick's many activities within HL7 and his day job, where we keep him busy, also at Lantana. So now is your opportunity to tell us something else. In addition to where you're dialing in from, we'd like to know a little bit about what your area of expertise is, your area of interest. You know, I have to keep turning on and off the show responses to get it to refresh. So please take a moment to tell us a little bit about yourself. And while you do that, I'll tell you the agenda for our remarks. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the context of CDA and FHIR. I assume everybody is well educated in this. I know there are a lot of efforts in Europe to spread information on CDA, and I hope a little bit, at least, on FHIR. So I'm just going to do a very brief introduction there, and then talk about the concept of an integrated ecosystem, where we're getting the most out of both families of standards. And then I'll hand it to Rick, who will talk more in detail and provide examples of how these two primary approaches to a heterogeneous standards environment, how they work. Now, this is fabulous. I love seeing these word clouds grow. And it's wonderful that we have such a diverse area of interest here. But I am interested in moving along. So I'll give it just another second because it's so wonderful, but I'll go into our brief history of CDA and FHIR while we're all watching this grow. The CDA is, of course, the HL7's clinical document architecture. We're all working off of essentially the base standard of Release 2, which was published in 2005. And in technology terms, that's it's like how many generations? That's 6 generations ago, which is both good and bad. It shows some stability, which is always good for cross-enterprise development. But it also we can also introduce CDA by saying it's old. So FHIR, we're working from. I am going to switch this now, so I get some notes on the screen for you. FHIR, we're working on Release 4, which was published in 2019. I know Release 5 is in the works, and if you want to get an update on where things are with FHIR, that's a good question to queue up in the chat for Rick, and he can address that at the end of our prepared remarks. So FHIR is the new standard. It's built de novo from the ground up. And in other words, for those of you who remember the reference information model, which was the sort of the constitution and fundamental law of standards at HL7 for a while, FHIR is not tied to the RIM, although it certainly benefits from that modeling. It uses, in addition to XML, which is also the basis for CDA, it assumes JSON as an alternative syntax, and it does clinical documents. Catherine mentioned the FHIR Documents project, CCDA on FHIR. So it has a full, robust set of applications for clinical documents, but it does more than that. it has an integrated or fundamental RESTful services API. Here in the US, we consider it still an emerging standard. It is, without question, going to be the dominant standard for clinical information in the US. It is not yet fully supported in electronic health records. So the topic for today is very relevant in the US, as we hope it is for you as well. So just a little bit deeper on CDA. So it's a defined authenticated part of the record. Human readability is required. It was one of the things that CDA brought to the table that was, I think, responsible for its uptake at this particular point in time. And coded structured data is defined by templates according to particular use cases. Critically, the A in CDA is an architecture, so the base standard is constrained for particular use cases. Back in the day, when it was developed, we had to conform to what was called the HL7 version 3 methodology, where there was to be a complementary standard, a messaging standard, to provide a complementary integratable API, but that proved largely impractical. So some things worked really well, other things didn't work out so well, and there's a layer of complexity in CDA that the need for that complexity has fallen away. And the need for a complementary API is in the forefront. So FHIR, Fast Health Interoperability Resources, here's the manifesto, and it's interesting to see the manifesto here has some clear carryover from CDA in supporting human readability as a base level of interoperability and supporting multiple paradigms through an architectural approach. But it also, this manifesto also focuses successfully on the areas where CDA was weak. The focus on implementability is critical, and also making the content freely available is a different approach to definition of how the IP is distributed from HL7. So some key similarities and key differences. Definitely borrowing, inheriting from CDA and improving in a ground-up new approach. So just a brief summary: similarities, human readability is required. There is a strong suite of validation and authoring tools for both standards. They both support constraint CDA through templates, FHIR through profiles, based on use cases. FHIR goes beyond these similarities to provide the capacity to be useful out of the box. It's at a not as high level of abstraction. So the components, the base resources, are implementable without profiling, although profiling is highly recommended when exchanging outside a single entity. And the other items there, which are unique to FHIR, we've already discussed. So what, if CDA is working, why not stay with it? Well, you may want, and there's a tremendous advantage to having a complementary API, a simpler data model. Not everything's a document. Sometimes you just need one piece of data. Why not just convert everything to FHIR? Well, if you're involved at all in the practicality of implementation, that ripping and replacing is, not always the best path when, if it's not broken, something is working, you do want to get your value from it. So this presentation, the remainder of this presentation, is about how we don't need to choose. We can get the best of both worlds while creating a solid pathway for an eventual migration from CDA to FHIR. And we're going to explain this, how to leverage your investment in CDA while taking advantage of FHIR, and this roadmap through two primary methods. So let me give you a heads up on those, the two approaches, and then Rick will take you further down this road. So there's the integrated team and the team that really operates as two teams handing things off one to the other. In the integrated team, information flows back and forth freely. There are differences, they're addressed, but it's a blended team, and at any given time, any member can be in the lead. In the handoff scenario, there's differentiation in roles. The teams remain independent, and there are clear boundaries that make that a little bit more concrete. The integrated team approach is one based on lossless, bidirectional transformation between CDA documents and FHIR. The handoff scenario, the information, the core clinical information, remains in CDA documents, but is managed through a FHIR API. So there are use cases, scenarios where each of these comes into play, and Rick will give you an example of those coming up. But basically, they can both be deployed individually or together in transitioning from an environment based on CDA to one that is heterogeneous, taking advantage of the availability of FHIR and allowing an ecosystem to continue to get value from CDA while FHIR is introduced in a non-disruptive manner. So with that, I'm going to ask you another question here. And while I'm doing that, Rick, finish your coffee. And I'll let you take over when we see this. Now, this is giving us percents, not actual numbers. I don't know how many people are dialed in, but I've heard a lot of pings. It's wonderful to have a nice group here. So very, very interesting, because I've lost touch with what's been going on in the EU. It's been a while since I've been able to attend a meeting there. So it's very good to get this picture of the environment. So I look forward to your questions and comments after Rick's prepared remarks, and I think this is ready for you, Mr. Geimer.
All right. So as Leora, thank you for that introduction, Leora. And as she mentioned, we're talking about two basically paradigms for exchange, basically letting CDA on FHIR. Leora, there we go. Sorry, I was going to say we lost your screen for a second.
Nope.
If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, it keeps showing the ocean there.
Right. That's the southern, that's Crete looking at Syria. But anyway, I'm just trying to turn my camera off, but I can't figure that out. Go ahead, Rick, sorry.
Okay, sure. So we're going to start talking about the integrated team. When you've got a team like this, generally you will agree on requirements, like what kind of data you're going to exchange, what data is required, what's optional, things like that. But you may have different infrastructures, different technology preferences, et cetera. So when you're an integrated team like this and you have the opportunity to do so, creating dual specifications in both CDA and FHIR is an excellent choice. This allows folks who don't have an investment in CDA to start with FHIR, which is generally easier to use, but those who do can leverage it. So I'd like to describe this a little bit more using an example from what's called the ONC HIP project. Next slide. And this is for a pharmacist care plan. So ONC stands for the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, and HIP stands for High Impact Pilot. So this was a project issued through the U.S. government, and the purpose was to demonstrate the exchange of pharmacy information using both CDA and FHIR. So we created dual implementation guides simultaneously and lossless transformations, bidirectional no less, between them. And originally this was to start off with a couple of pharmacy management system vendors and a state health agency called Community Care of North Carolina, or CCNC. And they were all interested in doing this, using CDA only. Fortunately, one of the early things in this project was, developing the implementation guides and then training participants in the pilot on it. And once we trained them on both CDA and FHIR, a lot of light bulbs started going off for people that, hey, maybe FHIR is easier. They'd been thinking they were going to go, CDA only because that's, there have been so many CDA-based exchanges going on. But after the trainings and all the hype that went on, we did additional trainings, brought in new people, and eventually we had over 20 participants in the pilot. And the receiving state health agency, community, CCNC, decided to actually change their approach. They were going to work based on CDA, and instead decided to go the FHIR route. And Lear, I think you skipped ahead. There we go. Okay, yeah. For some reason, your screen's taking a little while to update for me. It switched back. So basically, this allowed everyone to build according to their own infrastructure. If they had existing CDA-based systems, they could leverage those. But otherwise, they would create them in FHIR. Regardless, they would send them to CCNC, who would then run their CDA to FHIR transform if they received a CDA document, and their backend system would treat them indistinguishably. At that point, it was just FHIR. They certainly could have gone the other way and converted FHIR to CDA. That's the advantage of the bidirectional transforms, is any recipient can choose which format they want and build accordingly. Okay, now next slide. So to address a new use case like this, and if you're going to decide that you're going to go down this dual route, some things to consider is that generally people who are new to healthcare IT or new to Exchange at least tend to prefer FHIR over CDA, just because the learning curve is less steep. It uses things that are easily implemented using standard technologies, RESTful APIs, data types that everyone else uses and such. But again, there is that significant existing investment in CDA throughout healthcare IT. So the dual CDA FHIR implementation guide approach, paired with those bidirectional transforms, allows you to have the best of both worlds. New implementers can jump on the FHIR bandwagon. Others who are still using CDA and have invested in it significantly need just run transforms, and they can preserve their existing implementation and architecture and such. And it really just supports a transitional roadmap moving to FHIR over time. There are some key challenges with it around abstraction, data types, and nesting versus referencing. In terms of levels of abstraction, FHIR is a lot more concrete than CDA. And a great example is that FHIR has this resource called allergy intolerance. It's very simple. You can just tell from the name of it that it's everything about allergies and such. And you look at it, and all the fields that are in there pertain to it. They've got the first of all, the concept of an allergy. They've got the substance that you're allergic to, what the allergy manifests as, in terms of the reaction, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the base CDA model, there's nothing that tells you, that screams allergy. Rather, there's a sort of generic observation, which you can then profile, and you find very quickly that observation itself isn't sufficient. You then have to have these child observations underneath it to capture things like the reaction and so on. So what you end up finding out is that when you're mapping between FHIR and CDA, it's not a one-to-one relationship of FHIR profile to FHIR to CDA template. Rather, there's often a single FHIR resource that will map to multiple CDA templates and vice versa. Or the opposite is usually the case, where you've got multiple CDAs mapping to a single FHIR. But it does occur occasionally that you do get a single CDA template mapping to multiple FHIRs, but that's more rare. But again, that's all solvable as long as you're aware of that when you're getting started. Another, solvable, but I would say, just kind of not really difficult problem, but annoying is the data type differences. FHIR and CDA use different data types. CDA was built at a time when HL7 was interested in defining its own data types and not really looking at what the rest of the world was using in many ways. Whereas FHIR, came about later, and there's a big push to make implementation easy in order to support data types that were already built into libraries and things like Java and .NET and such, and JavaScript. So when you're converting from one to the other, you have to realize that you can't just take a CDA date and put it in a FHIR date field. You have to change the syntax a bit. But again, that's all easily solvable. One of the harder ones is more of a conceptual one. CDA uses a lot of deeply nested XML to represent its content, whereas FHIR takes a approach where you've got these resources that are really referenced everywhere. It's more like building blocks that you assemble versus this big monolithic XML document. So when you're converting from one to the other, you have to take that into account and also realize that there are cases in CDA where, because of its nested nature, sometimes the same information is duplicated in multiple places, whereas in FHIR, you just want to create it once and referenced everywhere. So you may have to do some deduplication or merging of information when you're converting, and that can actually be quite challenging. Okay, next slide. So the general process for doing dual implementation guide creation looks like this. I'll go into details on some of these key items in following slides, but in a nutshell, you're going to start with inputs, which are your requirements. You're going to analyze those requirements to make sure you understand them fully. Then you move on to development, which is where you will create CDA templates and FHIR profiles and actually bind to terminology. And you'll create your transforms and mappings during that mappings and transforms. I mean, opposite order there. And then finally, you'll validate the results. That means validating all profiles against all sample files, running the transforms, making sure that they are lossless, validating the results. So it's a lot of testing, a lot of validation of the output. And then at the end, you end up with some either a FHIR package or both a FHIR package and a CDA package, which is all the pros documentation as well as computable artifacts to implement either FHIR or CDA and run the transforms with them. So next slide, and we'll get into some details. So the inputs to this process can be pretty much anything. They can be existing forms if you're trying to represent something that maybe is a public health reporting example where they've got public health forms that people would fill out normally, and you want to take that and build a CDA and FHIR representation. There can be software requirement specifications. There can be spreadsheets with lists of data elements. All sorts of things can serve as the general business logic and requirements, etc. So those all feed into the next step in the process. So next slide, which is the data analysis. This is where you'll take all the information that you got in the inputs and try to put some structure in it so you can really understand the requirements. Typically, when we're doing this, we'll put these into some kind of an analysis spreadsheet where we list all the data elements, the pieces of information that are supposed to be exchanged, make sure we have a clear definition of them so we understand what the meaning is. And then we go in and begin doing some high-level mappings to CDA templates or FHIR profiles, identify whether things are mapped to an existing template, like maybe from consolidated CDA, or if we have to create a new one. We'll also note whether pieces of information, what the cardinalities are, whether they are optional, required, or repeatable. And then also during this process, we'll try to identify what terminologies are required so we can begin building value sets. One of the great things about this process is as you're walking through these data elements and trying to answer these questions, they often, this process will, identify incomplete and ambiguous requirements, and they can go back to the subject matter experts and get those resolved. Next slide. Once that analysis is in process, as you don't necessarily have to do these completely independently, but you can start refining those that analytical spreadsheet to actually build a mapping spreadsheet. This is where you get very concrete. You've identified and nailed down the cardinality. You're not trying to tease it out of the requirements anymore. You've clearly identified FHIR resources that you're going to be using and existing CDA templates and such. And during this process, we'll actually know, where the mappings are complete, where they still need work. That way, we can have some, overlap as we're waiting for things in the analysis phase. We can mark it as incomplete here, and then populate it later. But the idea of these mappings is there should be a sufficient level of detail in order to create the transforms. So these are something that you would hand off to a software developer and say, here, make this. Okay. So let's go next. Next slide. Okay, next is the development process. So this is where we'll go in and actually build the templates. So that mapping spreadsheet and the analysis spreadsheets will feed into creating the FHIR and CDA templates. FHIR profiles and CDA templates. Ideally, we would try to reuse as much as possible. That generally means in CDA development in the US, we would look at the consolidated CDA implementation guide and see if there are templates that are appropriate for a given data element. And on the FHIR side, we would look at the US core specification, which is a library of FHIR profiles for things like problems, allergies, meds, etc. If nothing exists that we can reuse directly, then we have to create new templates. They'll be based on the base CDA or FHIR specification, or potentially further constraints on existing ones. Then we'll go in, we'll update definitions, bind to terminology, create value sets, sometimes even creating coding systems if you have to. All right, next slide. For tooling during development, we do recommend using some kind of a structured editor. In the US, we often use Trifolion FHIR, and just disclaimer, that's a Lantana tool. It's an end-to-end implementation guide creation tool, has built-in profiling and terminology support. It's web-based and open source. And integrated with the FHIR implementation guide publisher. So you can run if you've created FHIR implementation guides before, there's a tool called the FHIR IG publisher, and you can run that directly from Trifolion FHIR over the web. A couple other tools that are done by FHIRly. Forge is a full-featured profile editor. It's a Windows desktop tool. I say full-featured in that nearly every piece of the FHIR specification that is profilable, you can profile. It's been around for a long time, a very good tool to work with. In fact, often when I'm building implementation guides, I'll switch between tools just to make sure that any profiles that I'm creating are truly portable. So SimpliFHIR is another tool from FHIRly. It's a web-based tool for assembling implementation guides. So often you'll create profiles in Forge on your Windows desktop, and then upload them to SimpliFHIR and assemble them into an implementation guide for publishing. Okay, next. All right, so the FHIR CDA transforms. This is where we'll take those mapping spreadsheets and build those bidirectional transforms from FHIR to CDA. One thing that really is required in this process and pretty much drives it is the creation of sample files. As we're building dual implementation guides, we're also going to be gathering sample data from the subject matter experts who we met with in the requirements phase. Sample data is one of the inputs that we often want to get. And then we'll take those and actually build sample instances in both CDA and FHIR, and then run them through the transforms. Not only will we validate them first against the spec that we create them with, but then we'll run them through the transforms and validate the opposite. So in other words, if we create a full CDA document for a pharmacist care plan, for an example, we will then validate that against the schematron schemas that are created during the development phase as we build the templates and such. Once that's valid, we then run it through the transforms and get a FHIR document. And then we would validate that against anything that's appropriate, such as in the US, we would use the CDA on FHIR specification, validate against that, and then any specific templates that were created for the use case, like the pharmacist care plan constraint on the CDA on FHIR care plan FHIR profile. And then, once you've run them back and forth, the ones you've created them samples natively in each specification, run them back and forth, everything validates. This is where you actually want to then go and test them further at something like a FHIR Connectathon or a pilot to make sure that actual data from each participant in the team is usable and valid. And again, that will further refine not just the transforms, but often the specifications themselves. Okay, next slide. And then lastly, validation. I think I kind of mentioned that already. You want to make sure everything validates against the appropriate target standard. So on FHIR, you would use the FHIR validator, which is built into the FHIR IG publisher as well. On the CDA side, you would validate against the CDA XML schema and any custom schematron for the templates that are in there. All right, next. So in summary, this approach allows folks who have an existing investment in CDA to preserve that. If they're new, they can just start off right from the bat with FHIR. There are significant challenges through this approach, but none of them are showstoppers, especially if you scope your implementation guides and your transforms to well understood use cases. All right, next. All right, so the next paradigm here is the team handoff. This is where you've got folks who really aren't necessarily communicating with each other, but they, they're using things like agreed upon exchanges for a health information exchange, or HIE. So next slide. So the idea is we've got, HIEs are exchanging millions of CDA documents today. You're not going to get them to change overnight to FHIR. But what can be done is to incrementally adopt FHIR, starting with the use of RESTful APIs versus, things that alternatives that, are in use in many HIEs today, which are SOAP-based alternatives like IHE-XDS. Basically, this ends up, what you end up here is a mixed model where you have, you can map the CDA header to a FHIR document reference resource. The payload can still be CDA, but over time could possibly move to FHIR as well. And a great example of this approach is the IHD Mobile Health Document Specification, or MHD. Next slide. So a little bit of background first. MHD is a implementation of, or behind the scenes was meant to basically be a facade for IHE's XDS, or Cross-Enterprise Document Exchange. That's a primary HIE exchange mechanism for CDA documents in the US. It allows any kind of document content, so it can be CDA, FHIR, PDF, whatever. But it is a SOAP-based API, which is, frankly, starting to show its age. A lot of people don't like to create new implementations using SOAP these days. They tend to prefer RESTful APIs. So that's where MHD comes in. It serves as a FHIR facade for XDS. It uses the FHIR document reference resource and FHIR RESTful APIs. If you are an HIE or someone else who has implemented XDS behind the scenes, then you can basically bolt on MHD to provide RESTful access to documents. If you're not using XDS behind the scenes, you can still use the document reference resource and a native FHIR server to do exactly the same thing. And in fact, you can comply with the MHD profiles if you wish to. So the next slide will illustrate this a little bit better. So here we have the official diagram that comes out of IHD, the IHE MHD spec. And everything in the middle that says XDS and also that patient identity source are sort of you can think of that as a black box for how a document registry repository is implemented, at least in the US often. But then the things that say MHD on them are really how a FHIR client would interact with that system. So let's advance the animation here. So you can think of all the XDS related stuff as sort of a logical FHIR server. And from the FHIR perspective, a client is just, if they're an information source, they're doing a post or a put of a document reference resource and the embedded CDA content within it. And if they're a consumer, then they would do a FHIR get to query or retrieve individual documents. And really, again, that box in the middle that says logical or physical FHIR server, you can just completely replace that with a FHIR server. The patient resources in there become the patient identity source. The document reference metadata becomes the registry information that is searched for, and the CDA documents that are referenced from it or embedded in it become the repository. All right, so next slide. So here's an example of how this might work in the real world with a CDA document. You take a CDA file, like a pharmacist care plan or a continuity of care document. You extract enough header metadata to create a document reference resource. And just so you know, if you're doing straight IHE XDS, that SOAP-based one, you have to do the same thing, but you have to create what's called an XDS header, which is its own, SOAP-based XML. So this is work you have to do anyway, I guess is what I'm saying. But document reference is a lot more streamlined, and you can use JSON versus XML. Then you associate the CDA document with the document reference resource. You can either do that by base64 encoding and embedding it, or you can post it to what's called the binary endpoint of a FHIR server and then reference it. So then at this point, you post the document reference as the MHD document consumer. And if there's a XDS-based backend, it would just convert it to the XDS SOAP, make a call to the XDS system basically there, and everything else works. That document that you just posted via FHIR is now available throughout the HIE via either FHIR or XDS SOAP-based queries. So really, it's the best of both worlds. People can choose whichever API they prefer, but again, since you're working kind of in the blind with other people, you're going to stick with what's sort of being exchanged today, which is CDA as a payload. Next slide. So here's an example of how you would map that CDA header information. I've tried to draw arrows between them. So for instance, the clinical document ID would map to document reference identifier. The code element, which defines the document type code, becomes document reference.type. So what you find here is a lot of the fields have names have slightly changed, but the content is often those same. Those identifiers, the things that are in extension or root in the ID, for instance, will map pretty cleanly to the fields in identifier, with the exception that the root OID in CDA needs to be prefixed by URN:OID to make it a valid URI. So again, little data type changes, as I mentioned before. The effective time in CDA maps to document reference.date, but you have to make changes to the data types. But these are all fixable, doable, and once you do, then again, you can expose this and query the content through FHIR. Next slide. All right, so Lyra, you want to start on the conclusion part?
Sure, I'll take us out. Thank you, Rick, so much. So we'd love to hear from you. What's on your roadmap? And we have, for that purpose, our final poll here, which is about your FHIR plan. So we know that a large number of you are either working in a FHIR environment or a mixed environment. And as we extend that, I will hand it back to Diogo, Isabel, Catherine, if they have questions that have come up in the chat. I have not been monitoring the chat, and I assume Rick has not either. So if you have questions for us or about the X-eHealth project, go ahead, fire away.
But where is the chat?
Yeah, Carl, just one question. We are going to open the questions. So thank you so much for Liora and Rick for putting this presentation together and to be strict with the time. I think that was a very important one, to have, let's say, these 10 minutes for some question and answer. So at this point in time, at least on our side as the organizer, I would like to say at least to hear a little bit what the audience would like, let's say, to put some questions. Of course, we do got around, let's say, 172 participants, so it's quite remarkable. And at this point in time, please raise your hands if you do have any question at this point in time that we'd like us to put to the speakers. And of course, at this point, I don't think that the chat it is able to everyone, so I think this option, it is a plus. So I right away pass the floor to Vincent. In a way, he represents the people that work in two different levels at the European level. One, it is about, let's say, the Health Network technical subgroup from the Health Network, and the second head, it is of course the work package leader working on the specifications of the work package 5. So in a way, I think it will be important for you to address some questions, because inside of the work package, we quite discuss a lot on how can we evolve, or how can we merge the specification that we are creating in CDA that in the end needs to be used, or there are some expectations to use FHIR as well. Vincent,
yes.
to you.
Yes, thank you very much. In the X-eHealth program or project, I must say, there's a work package 5, and that is a work package focusing on functional specifications. We made a distinction between functional and technical specifications. And we'd love to discuss with you the possibility to create both CDA and FHIR from a more logical, on a more logical level. We also would like to talk with you about modular approach of data elements that can be reused. Because if you are going to transform that many thousands of CDA documents, you will have the same job over again and again. And I was wondering what you were thinking on reusing things, data elements that have been clearly defined and that can be reused also in the document specifications, because in that case, the transform would also be easier because you recognize one module and you say, okay, this is something that we already have done, and then we can already translate that. So I hope I've made my question clear. Thank you.
We do, Enrique, we do have other person in the chat. Do you like, let's say, to get the two questions at once, or do you like, let's say, to Q&A, to receive one question and give the answer?
Probably one at a time is my preference due to short-term memory.
Go ahead, Reed.
But yeah, I agree completely with what you're saying. I mean, as I mentioned when I was discussing the analysis phase, one of the things that we do there first is look at precedent, look at what's gone before, and try not to reinvent the wheel. So leveraging existing libraries of data elements, especially when you've got things like transforms and such associated with them, and building that over time is critical to make this scale. Leora, anything to add?
No, I think there's a lot more to say, particularly in how to use the tools that support the template and profile libraries. But yeah, that's definitely the way to go.
Yeah, in Europe, for instance, we use a lot of art decor. I'm sure you've heard of it. Yeah,
of course.
So, but we can discuss that later. But it's just curiosity. Thank you.
So I would like to say now that the second raised hand that we have in the chat, it is Mr. Carl Strotman, that it is working as well with us in the Unicom as a coordinator for a project that it is supporting the identification of medicinal products by using the ISO EDMP. Carl, what it is your question that you like to put to Rick and Leora?
Yeah, I have a basic question to you. First of all, thank you for this presentations. I'm a novice to this field. I'm not a FHIR expert, I'm not a CDA expert. And looking around, at least in Europe, I found or have the impression that each country is developing its own FHIR resources, or even medical domains are developing their own FHIR resources. And I wonder how FHIR then can solve any interoperability issue across Europe, because we need semantic interoperability so that any nurse, any doctor can really understand what is in a record. And if every country, for instance, looking at vaccination records right now across Europe, each country is doing its own thing. How can FHIR then solve this interoperability issue? Or is it just something to play with in a given domain, but not to really lead to international interoperability?
Yeah. Well, let me start with just I want to tweak what you said a little bit. Generally, because I'm one of the co-chairs of the FHIR infrastructure working with beta 807, and generally what we find is countries aren't actually creating their own resources, which are those basic building blocks of FHIR. Rather, they're creating profiles on them. So you gave the immunization example. There is an immunization resource which has an international scope, and everybody agrees on the basic, what you call the 80% of what's needed. And then what individual countries or other organizations often do is they will take that and profile it. They'll say, okay, where this field is a coded field, we're going to choose to use SNOMED as the terminology. Or they might say, well, for our country's use case, we have a particular national identifier that we want to use, so we're going to create a specific identifier type requirement on here. So at that base FHIR level, though, they're still interoperable. The hard part, though, is agreeing on the terminologies, and that's where you kind of need, either national or in your case in Europe, a multinational, EU level FHIR profiles, so you can get that kind of exchange interoperability. So I agree that there is some work that needs to be done at the meta level if you want true interoperability, and that goes beyond just EU internal stuff. If you're exchanging internationally, US to EU, or trying to create something that works globally, that is going to continue to be a problem. And until everyone agrees on using the same terminology everywhere, that piece of it won't go away.
If I may have one short remark on that as well, I think I understand the question. There's a lot of divergence, but on the other hand, in the current project that we're working on across eHealth, we're working specifically on European specifications and hopefully even global. So yes, at the moment there's a lot of everybody is doing his own thing, but there's a growing convergence, and that becomes from the understanding that it's all about the same patient. We're wasting our energy, and we'd better do it together, and then we have a much better solution.
Maybe Giorgio or Catherine, maybe you have a comment on this.
Well, I think that interoperability. Maybe you can switch off somebody.
Yeah, I think somebody
Okay.
needs to.
I think that interoperability is incremental. I saw some slides of Liora from many years ago when she was talking about this. So it's something that we work on. And the libraries that were mentioned in the presentation of Liora and Rick, and also the common components that are built right now in Europe, are the basis on which interoperability will be built. I would like also to mention the International Patient Summary work, which has created this library of components that will be reused. And that's where I think it's valuable to see this duality that Rick very eloquently described between templates and resources. And we need to think that way as we move forward to harmonize our thinking and elaborate our level of expectation from interoperability.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Sosa, for the show there.
I just, from the US, I want to say I am not a cat, but I do have a cat.
So I just saw, I don't know if there is any final remarks from the rest of the group. I saw in the chat that Christoph pointed out a topic that in a way he tried to answer. I don't know, Christoph, do you like to say to get the floor?
Thank you, Diogo. Yeah, Christoph here, HL7 Germany and HL7 Europe. So across Europe, we try to bring people together from different affiliates, which are the national representations of HL7 in Europe. So experts from all the countries can join this technical coordination team. So we are connecting the different implementations across Europe. So that's basically the idea.
Great.
So I don't know if Liora and Rick, you can stay tuned for 5 more minutes, because just for some final questions. So as one topic, as we have mentioned previously, in the outcomes of the project, this is really our ambition. It is like Liora, Rick, and of course Vincent have stated, we want, let's say, to start building this common framework, and this is what X-eHealth it is about, to build common specifications, common implementation guides that really have been made jointly with the different countries, with the different experts, that can be used at the national level and for cross-border projects as well. This is the mindset, this is the rationale. We are in a very good pace, and I think even this specific workshop have highlighted a lot of our questions that we do have. Of course, we need, let's say, to maybe to have an internal discussion with it, and to schedule a specific meeting for our questions with Liora and Rick later on. But this is my uptake, at least from the overall landscape. Any final questions to the group and to the audience? This is open to all, so don't be shy. If there is any specific topic, any question, these slides will...
Diogo, by Jürgen and by Andreas. Kingler.
Yep.
Now I saw it. Go ahead, Jürgen.
Okay, so this is Jürgen from IG. I just want to copy what was said before about this convergence. Convergence is not happening on the level of the standard. It's happening in the heads of the people. So it's our all responsibility to open up their eyes, all of the projects out there, and look around and see what's happening somewhere else and try to connect to those other initiatives. The standards development community as a whole has created some mechanisms like, for example, the FHIR community process or the Global Consortium for EHS Interoperability or IAG as a profiling organization where such convergence can take place. It's just the responsibility of the projects to search out for these possibilities and feed those with requirements so that we can come to globally aligned solutions.
I concur.
Thank you so much for that comment. This is one of the main roads that we take, and why that IAG and Agile 7 are, let's say, really partners in the cross-health. So to Andreas Kingler. Andreas, I don't hear you. I know that you unmute your mic, but we don't have any sound on your side.
Diogo, while we're waiting, I'll just let people know that in addition to the recording, we make the slides available. We'll PDF them, Diogo, and send them to you. Rick and I do have another obligation where they're waiting for us. So if it's okay, maybe if there's nothing urgent.
So let's do the following. Everyone that registered in the event have used, let's say, the mailing list of the Secretariat. Drop your questions to us. We'll try, let's say, to bulk them and then to try to send it out some answers when we do have them. Please, as we said, we are going, let's say, to try to make this information available in the website. This session has been pre-recorded. What I would like to say is really thank you to everyone that have the time to participate in today's session. And it is really an astonishing momentum for the cross-health to build the community and to have the people here. Thank you so much for your time. I don't know, any final words from you, Leora?
Rick, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's really been a pleasure.
Yes,
and,
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great, and look forward to follow-up questions and seeing how things evolve there and being back in touch with you all.
And physically presenting in Europe in 6 months, hopefully. So Catherine, get invites ready.
Thank you so much for making the time for us. Have a great day.
Okay,
bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excellent presentation.